as someone from a place with a lot of like wind energy, I'm excited to see how like storage for that specifically, and just like large scale storage in general. I want to see how that can like directly affect where I'm from in Montana and how that can potentially like energize our future.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of In Plain English, the podcast that is all about making science approachable, open source, and jargon-free. I am your host, Jamie Moffa, and today we are going to be talking about a really interesting topic, energy storage, and specifically the paper, a review of electrical energy storage technologies, materials, and systems, challenges, and prospects for large-scale grid storage by Turgut M. Gur. And presenting this paper is our expert, Maria Bruce. Maria, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Maria Bruce. I'm working on my PhD in energy, environmental, and chemical engineering at Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm happy to be here.
We are happy to have you. I'm so excited about this paper, actually. And then our guest for this episode is Ezra House. Ezra, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Ezra. I am a recently graduated graphic design student, so far from an expert on anything about science at all.
Fantastic. I feel like graphic design is so cool. Yeah. So with all of that out of the way, Maria, do you want to start us out with a little bit of an introduction to this review article and kind of why this is an important topic to be talking about right now?
Yeah. So as Jamie mentioned with the title of the paper, this article talks about energy storage technologies and what the challenges look like for large-scale grid storage. Focus there. This is especially important whenever we talk about integrating more renewable energy into our electrical grids. Talking about renewable energy has been a hot topic for a long time and is great, but there are different challenges that come up with that energy storage is an option to help combat. The paper it goes through some different types of energy storage, mechanical, thermal, electrochemical, and chemical storage. My focus area is on electrochemical energy storage, seeing as my personal research is on redox flow batteries.
Can we talk a little bit about, so why is it a challenge to integrate renewable energy into the electrical grid, and why would you need energy storage for that?
Yeah, so some of the most common types of renewable energy that we talk about is solar and wind. Well, if you have solar panels that you're relying on for your energy, what do you do at night? And that's considered the intermittence of these sources. Same with wind power, what happens when you have very stagnant air happening. So you go through these periods where there is a lot of production for those renewable sources, and then periods where you're producing very little or nothing at all. So if you are relying entirely on renewable energy in this example scenario, then you would have power if you were doing solar during the day, and then you would have no power in your home at night. Whereas if you had an energy storage technology paired with that, you would be producing enough power to combat your peak demand that you would have. And then during the off periods, you would be saving that, and some people would sell that energy, or you would be producing energy at a mid-level where whenever the demand is lower than what you're producing, then you're saving that energy, you're storing it. And then whenever the demand is higher, you're discharging that storage device.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The introduction to this paper talked also about how this could be useful for communities that don't have quite as robust of a grid as most of the continental US has. Can you talk a little bit about that and how this is useful for maybe sort of smaller grid?
Yeah. So along the line of what I was saying before, where you have, kind of what your peak demand is going to be. So you're able to find that middle line of what is the ideal operating condition for this, so that you're storing enough energy for the times that you do need to discharge. So you're charging enough to have the discharge capacity that you need. And that's really helpful for microgrids because you're able to do sort of that modeling and estimation for what those demands would require.
I think it's really interesting. It's things that I've never really even thought of before, which is almost silly to say, like the way that renewable energy is stored. I don't know why that never crossed my mind. But is there a reason why like non-renewable energy is easier to store than non-renewable energy?
That's such a good question. And actually, the answer is they aren't storing it. So fossil-based facilities are designed to operate at one constant level. They generally operate at whatever their peak demand is. And then anything they're producing beyond that, they sell or just waste. So they aren't storing it. There's not an energy storage technology paired with those fossil facilities generally. That's actually a path to getting industry acceptance of energy storage technologies before we're able to do the heavy renewable integration, sort of fields that are resistant to the renewable energy side of things. There is a process in which energy storage can be applied to these fossil-based facilities as well. So then rather than operating constantly at their peak demand, they would operate at a lower level so that then they had the energy storage paired with it. And then they would operate very similarly as I described for the intermittent sources. They would be able to charge up the energy storage device whenever they were operating above what the demand is, and then discharge it when the demand was higher. So it would save, of course, cost for them, cost of materials, which is a big thing for those who are operating those facilities, but of more interest to us most likely would be using less of those fossil fuels. It would still be a facility operated at it, but if you're operating at a lower condition, producing less of it and not overproducing, then you're still moving in the right direction for our environment.
Gotcha.
Kind of reminds me of all of the food waste that like industrial agriculture produces.
Yeah, because these facilities really, they're not designed to be able to start up and then shut everything down and then start back up differently. A shutdown and startup process for most plants is a very intense endeavor. So there's not a way with the way that the plants are designed to adjust how the amount of production that's happening without having something to store it in. Because without storage, there's not really an answer to that. Either you produce at the peak demand or people go without power.
When there is like too much power produced, what does it mean to waste that? Like, how is electricity wasted? So
instead of it being routed to whoever's would be using it, it genuinely is just like the burning of the fuels and then the release of whatever is produced from that burning, that reaction, and it's just offlet. Whether it's like it produced through heat, that heat is no longer being used there's no end goal to it. It's just released. And that's not quite the area that I'm as familiar with on what that waste looks like. I more so focus on how to prevent it from happening.
Gotcha.
Yeah, there was a statistic in the article. I think it was specifically about how much renewable energy was wasted, that even in grids that are integrating some renewables already at peak production and low demand, they have to actually waste quite a bit of the energy they produce, or they actually have to sell the energy to, or not sell, but like they have to pay other places to take their energy.
Right. Which seems weird to me. Like,
Yeah.
why are you paying somebody to take your renewable energy? But yeah, like if you have these solar panels collecting the sun rays, but you have most things turned off, like in a small scale, like at your home or something, but you don't have a use for that energy, if it's not being stored, then nothing's happening with it. And sometimes it's easier to talk about things in terms of like what it looks like for a single house, because that's something people would be more familiar with and a better idea of when you use energy in your home. But these storage technologies are really more for microgrid type things. They're less so designed for a household basis as opposed to larger scale grid stability. It's just a reference point I like to use because it feels relatable.
Yeah, it's harder to imagine, like, because you said the batteries that you work on are ultimately designed to be like building sized.
Yes.
Which is not what we usually like. The biggest battery I can think of is in a car.
Right. Yeah. These are very different types of batteries. Rather than batteries for devices, these are batteries for like grid stability. So flow batteries in larger applications have reservoirs of electrolytes that are the size of buildings.
That's insane. I'm imagining a grain silo, but it's just
electrolyte.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically.
Is that really genuinely the size of some of these batteries? That might be a dumb question, but
yes.
That's crazy.
There aren't a ton of redox flow batteries. They're not as commercially accepted because there are challenges that come up with them. The most developed flow battery is the vanadium redox flow battery, and vanadium is not very abundant, and this is very expensive. So you're not going to go down the road and see these out right now, but there are implementations of these batteries out there, and they genuinely are the size of buildings.
That's so cool. I don't know why I never thought about it, like just needing that sort of scale to it.
Right. There's also challenges with that scale being required, because if your electrolyte is the vanadium in a high concentration sulfuric acid, it's a little nerve-wracking to consider a building size vat of high concentration sulfuric acid. So that's another challenge when considering these batteries, the ones that are highly acidic, the maintenance of those facilities.
I think maybe we should give our audience a little bit of a idea of what these flow batteries, which is one way to store that energy when you're producing more than demand. So like what the flow batteries look like, and in plain English description of like how they work. Why do we need vanadium in high concentration sulfuric acid?
Yes, of course. So a flow battery, rather than what you think of as device scale, these are building size batteries, and they offer a unique advantage when it comes to large scale storage, because you can scale the power independently from the storage capacity. So that means you can independently scale how much power you can generate at one time, completely separate from long-term, I want to be able to store this amount of energy to have at my disposal. You're able to scale those separately because this battery is set up as two large external reservoirs, which contain your electrolyte, your positive electrolyte and your negative one. And that is connected by pipes or tubing to the stack in the middle. And that stack in the middle contains the rest of the battery components. So whenever you're not using the battery, nothing's being pumped. It's the electrolyte stays in its reservoir. So unless you're charging or discharging, the electrolyte is not in contact with where reactions happen at all. But whenever you're wanting to charge or discharge it, you pump that liquid from the reservoir into this stack where your reaction happens. And essentially an electron from one side is going to switch over to the other side, and it changes the charge state of the electroactive material and the movement of that electron from one side to the other. And then the electrolyte pumps back into the reservoir, and then you have these liquids stored at a different oxidation state than they were before. So then whenever you want to discharge it, you pump it back through, and then that electron moves back over, and it switches, the oxidation state switches back.
And there's energy associated with this. So when you're charging it, you're like putting in energy to make, you can kind of think of it, at least from my college chemistry, which is the last time I really did any chemistry. But when you're charging it, you can kind of think of it as pushing the electrons uphill. So they're getting into a more sort of energized state. And when you're discharging it, the electron is rolling downhill and releasing the chemical energy, which can be used to generate power.
Yes. And the storage of it comes in the fact that you have two different materials. You have two different materials, one on each side that is able to be in different oxidation states. So it allows you to store that electron essentially like on one side or the other side based on whether you're charging or discharging it. And as long as those materials stay in the oxidation state that they're in, time won't really impact whether the energy you have stored there is going to maintain in that vat, if that makes sense. Like, you're not going to, in the ideal scenario, you're not losing energy. You charge it a certain amount, and because it's stored as the oxidation state of that material, and if it stays in that state, then you're not losing the energy, and you get that energy back whenever you switch it back to the other one. If
so
that
it's not like
sense.
if you just sort of leave a device battery sitting around, it'll kind of discharge on its own. It doesn't really do that.
Right. A large reason that happens with batteries being left alone has to do with the electrolyte being in constant contact with the electrodes, which is another benefit to these slow batteries, is you don't have that constant contact where a reaction isn't happening when it's unnecessary.
Because of the big tanks that you usually are keeping the electrolyte in.
Yeah. As opposed to our small little batteries that we have in our phones, those are great for their use. They have a very high energy density, and they're great for their uses. But when it comes to large scale storage, there's just not that transition, that applicability of those batteries to something this large.
My question is, as the demand for how much energy can be stored, as it kind of scales upward, what are the challenges as it goes from a device scale battery to something larger? What makes it get so much difficult from a device scale to a larger scale battery storage?
So there's actually a really interesting figure connected to that in the paper we looked at. It was figure 8, the comparison of power ratings and discharge time scales of various electrical energy storage systems, which was a lot of words, but it essentially has to do with how long you can charge a device and then let it sit and then be able to discharge it.
Okay.
So the discharge time at whatever rated power. And then you also have to consider the power ratings as how scalable the batteries are, how much power can be produced from one of these batteries based on current technological developments, because there's various work that's done on all of these constantly to progress them in the direction people want. But there are limits to what has been studied on the scalability of different batteries, or energy storage devices. I say batteries because that's what I work on the most, but storage devices in general.
Well, there's also, and this was super cool, and I would like to include it as an aside. So the biggest way, we're talking about batteries for grid storage. Actually, currently the biggest way that energy is stored that is produced by grid scale systems is pumped hydro. So it's the same thing as like hydroelectric energy, except for you're using excess energy produced by the grid to pump water to the top, and then it literally flows down and makes energy. So that's like 96% of the way that we currently store grid scale energy.
Right.
Which is not really a battery. It's just water.
Yes. Yeah. That is the most common form. It definitely slide into battery discussion just from the nature of my work, because there are various limitations to pumped hydro. They're very geographically dependent. So if you're not in a region where there is a large amount of water that you could have a pumped hydro facility at, then you're just out of luck for that type of energy storage. And that's a benefit to the research and progress in a lot of different storage technologies, so that we have various options, and whatever best fits the region or the scenario, there are different options for what's going to be best for that. Because if you have access to pumped hydro, there might not necessarily be a need for another form. But if you live nowhere near water, then pumped hydro is not an option.
In like Arizona.
Right.
Maybe they're not doing pumped hydro in Arizona.
Right. But that shouldn't mean they don't have the access to increasing the penetration of renewable energy into their grid.
But the other one that was really cool to me while we're talking about not batteries was that they literally pump compressed air into like underground caverns and like geological formations, and then release the pressurized air as a way of generating energy.
Yeah.
That was crazy. I was like, I didn't know we were fully pressurizing caverns to store energy.
And the minds that come up with that solution to like storing and finding energy, I'm just like fascinated by the thought process that goes into even finding that solution. That is so sick.
Because the big thing with energy storage is taking energy produced one way and storing it in some way that's a different form of energy. So like the pumped hydro, for example, you're using that to electrically operate these pumps, and you're moving water up, and then you've got this water elevated, and then whenever that rushes down, that's the release of potential energy, from what you might remember from like earlier science classes. So you're storing electrical energy into potential energy, and then retrieving it back as electrical energy.
And then bringing it back to the batteries are electrical energy to chemical energy with those electrons.
Yes.
That are being stored
electrochemical.
Electrochemical energy, and then back to electricity.
Yes. I say electrochemical because there are chemical energy storage technologies out there as well.
Oh, how are those different?
So rather than electron transfer being the method, so that's the electrochemical side of things, it's more so, I believe, hydrogen storage would be considered chemical storage, where, say, you have electrolyzers that you operate to split water, and then you have hydrogen, and then you are storing it as the hydrogen. So rather than the operating of something to move electrons, you're inducing a chemical reaction rather than an electron transfer. So that's what makes it electrochemical.
Doing the chemical reaction the other way releases energy.
Yes. Hydrogen's not a good example for that part, because hydrogen is generally used in other things. You wouldn't be transforming it back.
The hydrogen itself is what you want. It's not just
in
a
that
storage
scenario.
medium.
Yes.
Okay.
So fuel cells often, there are various devices that hydrogen would go into.
This is so just like the breadth of things. I think I will like pull out this figure 8 and put it on the website as its own thing, because it shows, I think, really well the breadth of ways that we can store energy across different power ratings and timescales. You can see, for example, why lithium ion and lead acid batteries are so ubiquitous, because they sit in this nice like minutes or minutes to hours time scale, and they can do a very wide range of power ratings.
Whereas then you have things like pumped hydro, or like on a smaller scale than that, flow batteries, where you really don't have those like short discharge time. So you aren't able to use those for certain applications.
Is that just because of like how big it is, or like what makes it not be able? I guess hydro kind of makes sense because it's a bunch of water.
Yeah. And that's generally that's a large part of it. But also, like, if you have a power rating that the lowest power rating for the module size is 10 kilowatts. So that's the on figure 8, the low end of the flow batteries. There are certain applications where you don't want the lowest power able to be supplied to be 10 kilowatts. Which then you look at lithium ion, which you're able to produce very small amounts of power if needed.
Because I'm looking at figure 53, and I'm just realizing how little I know about energy grids in general. I was wondering if, in very simpleton terms, if you could like step through the process of from generation all the way to the like primary customer, or even to like generation directly into storage.
So in figure 53, where it talks about the basic structure and layout of the electrical grid system. So you have whatever generating station is being used to produce this energy. And then the up transformer is used to be able to transfer and transport that energy through the transmission lines. So all of the like power grid lines that you see out and about. And then from those lines, then it's stepped back down into whatever customer might be paying for that energy. Usually it could be whoever's immediately using it, or it could then be going through another company.
Gotcha.
Or another distribution center.
So that's what that sub-transmission customer, I guess, is that they're the ones that are doing the final distribution to like businesses and homes.
Right. As opposed to the original people doing the generating of the power. The power generation plant isn't necessarily going to be who you're paying for your power from.
It is not all under one big energy conglomerate.
Right. And some scenarios there very well could be. But there's definitely options where that's not the case, and situations where that's not the case.
So where in this grid would storage go? Because there is currently not storage here.
Right. And this is also the structure of the U.S. electric grid system, which tends to be large grids as opposed to still large scale storage, but smaller grids. It would happen after generation, or it would happen before the customer. And that would kind of depend on who the customer is. Because I'm not saying that you would have that if you were receiving energy directly from the generator, but I would say this would happen immediately after this power is generated. It would be used in whatever storage device immediately, and then they would be the ones to distribute and discharge this device as needed according to demand.
Gotcha. And then it would go through this whole transmission, step down, customers, all that.
Yes. And there's a bit of design leeway in that, depending on what size grid it is and what the grid looks like, whether the generating station sends it to several sub-transmission customers, and then they're the ones who decide how to store it. There's some leeway in that, but generally I would imagine it happening pretty early on.
And I know that you said that like the actual like electric grid part of it is not entirely like what you are like your wheelhouse, but I was wondering like earlier on under like section H, the grid storage, it talks about how a lot of like transmission lines and power transformers are becoming obsolete or old. Does that affect the battery storage, like the age of some of these like grid components?
That is a good question that I don't know that I have an answer for. If the issue, since I'm not as familiar with what the issues that come up when transmission lines are old are, if the issue is that as it's moving along the lines, there's loss of power, then that would impact any sort of energy that's moving through those lines. Regardless of whether the energy is stored or not, if there are capacity losses along the route that it follows afterwards, that would impact the energy regardless of what happens to it before.
Now that I'm skimming through that first paragraph of section H on grid storage, there's actually a bit that says that the capacity of the transmission grid could be extended by putting the storage system downstream on the load side. So presumably around where that like sub-transmission customer, your like electrical power company, putting it there, I guess, which also later it talks about natural disasters. So putting it there could actually mean that if there's some natural disaster that affects something in generation or transmission, you'd have a little bit of backup capacity before people lose power, as opposed to right now, like if something happens at any of these steps, a whole bunch of people are going to lose power.
Right. Yeah. And that heavily depends on the size of the grid we're talking about, as well as whether the customer would have access to the type of storage that would be required. So if it's a small enough grid that things are going directly from generation to a direct household, for example, then there may not be that access to personal energy storage devices.
And this was earlier, but we were talking about just the scale of some of these storage devices. How like plausible is it to have these storage devices in like an urban setting? Like I'm thinking in St. Louis, trying to fathom like where to put one of these building sized batteries. Is that a concern with like making this like storage?
So if you're looking at doing this paired with one of the common renewables, so solar or wind, those large wind farms, it would be located at around that site. So there's already a large portion of land dedicated to these windmills or the solar farms where there's just solar panels across the area. There would be regions because you wouldn't want these batteries right. A large building size battery, you certainly would not want in a residential area.
Yeah.
But also you don't really have power generation plants in a residential area, whether that be fossil-based or renewables. Those large spaces where power is generated tend to be a bit separated. So it would be located in that type of area, not just along a neighborhood.
Yeah, if you try to do that in SimCity, your residents get really angry at you.
Yes. I would be too.
I think that maybe a little bit brings me to a question I had about the environmental impact of some of these storage solutions, especially since you know the most about batteries, of which there's two components, like obtaining the materials for the batteries, like what is the environmental impact of that? And then what is the environmental impact of, like, you said that some of them have really high concentration sulfuric acid. So I'm sure that's not good if your battery were to leak, for example.
Yeah. And that's something that is important when doing this research, is to consider what those impacts are. So looking at batteries that the electroactive material is more abundant, there's the benefit of it being less expensive, which is the larger industry draw to it. Being a bit self-aware when you're doing these studies. If you're proposing these as up-and-coming batteries, are there ways that you can look at a system that has not a strong acid, but is still able to function? And that comes down to individual systems and the importance and responsibility of researchers to consider those aspects as they are writing grants to study different systems. And of course, like any sort of application of these batteries would have to have extensive safety protocols, just as other plants always do. There are lots of other plants that have facilities, or you talked about sulfuric acid. What about the places that produce the sulfuric acid? They, of course, also have to have those same extensive safety protocols for the production of chemicals. So it would be similar. It's not unprecedented to have protocols designed and safety regulations around these potentially dangerous materials around the general public. So you would just apply those same type of procedures and expectations.
Like, what kind of response does the fossil fuel world have to these battery storage? Is this a hot topic and kind of a controversial one?
The development of these energy storage technologies can benefit them as well. Like whenever we are talking about them operating at what's called peak shaving conditions, where the constant level of operation is below that peak demand, and they're able to use a storage technology in addition to operating their plant at a lower level. There are benefits of these technologies existing for them as well. But of course, then there's also the added discussion of these technologies are often talked about in connection with renewables. So, of course, there's some pushback that can happen if people are not as pro integration of renewable energy, but storage technologies can benefit both sides of the discussion.
Gotcha.
And sometimes framing it as also being beneficial for fossil-based facilities is a step in the direction of having these technologies be further developed and further integrated. And then if the storage technology is more commonplace, then it's also easier to then combine those with renewables, and then renewables are easier to implement because the storage technology is more commercialized.
Okay.
When you say it that way, it does sort of make sense that you'd want to highly develop the storage technology first and then be like, well, we have all this storage. We could really easily handle like fluctuating renewable energy. Yeah.
Well, honestly, renewables have made so much progress in the past decade that like solar energy is very well developed. It's not as integrated because of these challenges, but it's an extremely well developed technology that's well understood, that's been progressed to where it's much cheaper to do than it used to be. It's relatively affordable, very well understood, but then there's the problem of the intermittence and the need for storage. So honestly, the storage is kind of a study that's trying to catch back up to where the renewable progress has gotten.
It's kind of a like bottleneck for being able to. So with solar, there's also an interesting component where it is fully possible and exists where individual homes have solar generation. And I've heard of things where like if your house generates more solar energy than it needs, it can sell it back to the grid. Does that also pose a challenge for integrating solar and renewables with the grid with all this energy storage if you have like the consumer pushing electricity also back into the grid?
That's a good question. I am not sure that there would be an instance where enough energy is pushed back into the grid, unless you are talking about a microgrid that covers a very economically well-off neighborhood where everybody has solar panels beyond their capacity of need. So I don't imagine that enough would be pushed in that direction for it to negatively impact things.
Yeah, because that's relatively small scale compared to the scale of the grid.
Yeah, or if there's the scenario where the consumer has these solar panels, but they don't have a storage technology. They're pushing it back into the grid stores it, and then pushes it back out to them whenever the sun's not out. Where then essentially, rather than selling it to them, they're really like paying for the storage of it. So it would be the grid having the storage of that power.
Would it at some point be possible for like individuals to have their own kind of batteries to go off of their like own solar panels, or would that be reflected back into the grid?
So that really depends on further development of these storage technologies as to the safety that would be required for such a commonplace technology to happen. It's not that it couldn't. There are plenty of backup generator type systems, backup batteries that are far more common in not the US. So it's not unheard of, but there would need to be regulation around it and making sure that whatever battery technology is available, that people would be able to maintain it safely.
Yeah, this is reminding me of an episode of a podcast that I listened to called It Could Happen Here. And they're kind of definitely like lefty anarchists. And some of them are also kind of preppers. So one of the episodes they were doing was about like living off the grid, and kind of like some of what they were talking about were individual or like household scale energy solutions. And they were talking about somebody who had kind of jerry-rigged their own like charging a battery from solar power generated from their house, and how like if you don't know enough about it, they definitely don't recommend trying to jerry-rig something like this because it could go bad.
It could. Just like jerry-rigging anything. There's a certain level of understanding of the dangers involved just to be aware of.
Yeah, if hydrochloric acid is one of the potential players in storing battery, I don't think that everyone should particularly have access to that.
No. Because then there's the added environmental concerns there.
Yeah.
Where now, like device batteries, for instance, you are not supposed to throw them away. You need to take them to battery recycling places. That would continue to be something of concern if then we had other batteries storing energy on a consumer basis, on a consumer level, how you would handle spills, how you would like dispose of things are all concerns that would come up. But flow batteries are not feasible for that small of a scale. Flow batteries specifically would be for grid storage. That battery technology would not have the efficiency and the charge density required for such a small.
And it's also not necessarily better for the environment to have a bunch of people have a bunch of like smaller batteries, because part of the point of having a grid at scale is efficiency, where you can do this thing like in a few places for a lot of people instead of a whole bunch of people having these batteries. Because again, like a lot of the times, and this is an area of research like Maria mentioned, but a lot of times the materials for the batteries are also expensive and taxing on the environment to obtain.
Because also like you look at not just the electrolyte being owned, but all of the components that are in the stack, and scaling it down to such a small level where you're having to repeatedly make these smaller stacks of all of the electrodes and the membranes and the current collectors and all of those components.
I guess on that point, I'm assuming you don't study these batteries in a building size to scale.
No,
How does that look
not.
like? Give the audience a little peek into what your lab research looks like. Obviously, nothing that would not be shareable, but
Right.
the general idea.
So some of my work that's done on the very fundamental electrochemistry level is just small electrodes in a small 10 milliliter thing of solution where I run electrochemistry experiments and see what the kinetics look like. So what the reaction would look like that would be happening in the battery. But the step up from that is we do have full cell like battery testing that we do. But rather than it being a stack, it's a single cell. So it's a single instance of your current collector and your flow fields and electrodes and membrane separators. And then on the opposite side of the membrane separator, you have the same components, but in reverse order for the other side of the battery. And then like a half a liter or less of electrolyte solution on each side. So then we have the small tubing that will go in and we're able to see how the battery functions and run it for however many charge and discharge cycles to study what the capacity looks like over time. So we're able to set up a smaller cell, and our lab has done like a couple of cell stacks, but nothing extremely large thus far.
And how much energy does one of those little ones produce? Like, could you charge your phone off of it?
I do not know. I do not have an answer to that.
Okay. I was just like, are you sitting there in lab with running this experiment, but then also you've got your like...
Jamie really wants these to be small scale application. They're like, but can I charge my phone? Like, Jamie, it's grid storage, but could I?
If my phone was dying and I was hanging out with you and for some reason there's no normal outlets in the lab.
Yeah. No.
No.
You should not be plugging that up to our experimental setup of a small flow battery.
Okay.
I have maybe like a more personal question, but how did you get started in this field? Like, what sparked this exploration into the subject?
Yeah, so I've actually been in this field for a while. Back in undergrad, I had joined a team that was under the American Institute of Chemical Engineers. There's the Chemi-Car like competitions, which you're essentially running a small little shoebox sized car based on starting and stopping with chemical reactions. And I had joined this little team at my university. And upon joining that, it was mentored by a staff scientist who worked in a lab in an electrochemistry lab. And I spoke with him and he asked if I had interest in doing research in the lab. And I responded, I don't know, because I'm a first generation college student and had no idea about research. And I was a little freshman in undergrad, a little 18-year-old, having no idea what I wanted to do. But I was always interested in renewable energy and environmental concern. But I too hadn't considered what the role of energy storage really was for that application. So then I started going in and being mentored by him and doing research in that lab. And I continued researching in that lab all through undergrad, where I did work in flow batteries, looking at different electrolytes, but worked on flow batteries and then decided that I wanted to continue doing that work for my graduate education and applied to schools that had researchers doing work in the redox flow battery field that I wanted to be involved in. So that's why I ended up here at WashU in Vijay Ramani's group.
Very cool.
I do love on the like meta level how it's those early interactions usually early on in college where you're like, I don't necessarily know what I want to do, but I guess I'll do this because it's an opportunity that I can see if I like it. And then that kind of ends up shaping a lot of your direction in research.
Yeah, it really did. Because I did other things and did an industry internship, but just kept coming back to doing research.
I have to ask because of, everything that's going on right now. So like,
I expected this question.
How is your field being affected by all of the current administration's decisions on funding? And
yeah, that's a good question. Right now, it is not being directly impacted, but we are all aware of what is coming, because once one field of science and research is being attacked, we're all being attacked. So despite what we do right now not having direct application in health, not being applied in the health field, it's currently not being touched as much, not talked about as much. But the framing of a lot of what we do has to do with connection and application to renewable energies. And if prioritizing being carbon neutral is no longer relevant, then that makes receiving funding more difficult. There's a route that can be taken where the grants are written focusing on the peak shaving conditions of fossil facilities, which is a way that we could continue receiving funding and getting grants, even if our internal preference and motivation for the study involves renewable energy. But then you would also have to show that there's enough economic benefit to them being paired with fossil facilities, because a lot of the benefit there is, once again, lowering emissions. So without the care and the prioritizing of environmental impact, the field will be under struggle. The answer is not as heavily impacted right this minute, but we all see what's coming and talk about it and try to prepare as best we can and stand up against the cutting of the funding for the other fields of research as well.
Is there anything that like someone who isn't directly attached to the science field, like something that a 20-year-old can do to like help support the scientists in my life?
Yes. Call your local representatives, call your elected government officials, tell them that you don't want science funding to be cut, to tell them how this impacts your community, and make it seen and known that you and everybody else that you know who is frustrated with these developments, that you don't support these decisions, and make sure the politicians who are elected know that their voting base doesn't support this, as well as any other various events that happen, protests and standing up for science, showing up for your local scientific community to see support from those in our area is important.
I can put all sorts of resources in the podcast description for our audience as well, because I'm sure that all of you, as people who listen to a science podcast, want to know what you can do to bring it all back around. I like to end each episode by asking folks what was either the coolest thing that you learned from this conversation in this paper, or something you're really excited to see from this field of research in the future.
As someone from a place with a lot of like wind energy, I'm excited to see how like storage for that specifically, and just like large scale storage in general. I want to see how that can like directly affect where I'm from in Montana, and how that can potentially like energize our future.
Yeah, for sure. I'm excited to see, because we were talking about storage being a bottleneck and how renewables like solar are already really well developed. I'm excited to see research like the research Maria is doing and other places that are working on this help energy storage catch up. And I feel like once that happens, there could be a really good explosion of integration of renewables into the grid, because the technology is there. on the energy side. We just need this side to catch up, and then things could really accelerate.
As somebody who's used to talking about my work with other people in either the field or a field's tangent to me, it's really hopeful and nice seeing people so far outside of what I do find it interesting and look forward to progress in the field.
Yeah, I was really, really excited when you chose this paper and I started reading through it. I think that it was an excellent choice for this podcast, and I had so much fun talking about it.
I'm glad. I highly recommend anybody who's interested go through and give at least part of it a read. It's a very long paper, but the introduction and background, I think, is well written and gives a nice summary of the state of technology in terms that is generally very familiar. Just don't be afraid when you open it and it's 70 something pages. Just reading kind of the beginning or whatever section is broken into different sections of the different types of technology. If there's a specific one you find interesting, there's a very helpful, neat breakdown of the different types of technology.
I think on that note, we will close it out. We have been having a lively conversation about the paper review of electrical energy storage technologies, materials and systems, challenges and prospects for large-scale grid storage by Turgut M. Gür. And we have been discussing this paper with Maria Bruce and Ezra House.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you, Jamie.
You can find the paper on our website at inplainenglishpod.org. While you're there, check out the Continue the Conversation tab to send in questions or suggestions for future episodes. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast, either as an expert or a non-expert, you can contact us at inplainenglishpod@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Twitter, Blue Sky, Facebook, and Instagram at Plain English Sci. That's PLAINENGLISHSCI. Our music is by Sam Brunwasser. You can find more of his music at soundcloud.com/visualsnowbeats. The logo is by the wonderful team at Biographics. That's Tania Lintz, Yolanda Campos, and Jessica Higginbotham. Thanks for listening, and tune in next time for another episode of In Plain English.